भूतले स्वयं रूपा कदा मह्यं ददाति स्वपदान्तिकम् वन्देऽहं श्रीगुरो श्रीयुतपदकमलं श्रीगुरुन् वैष्णवांश्च श्रीरूपं साग्रजातं सहगणरघुनाथान्वितं तं सजीवं साद्वैतं सावधूतं परिजनसहितं कृष्णचैतन्यदेवं श्रीराधा कृष्णपादान् सहगणललिता श्रीविशाखान्वितांश्च हे कृष्णा करुणा सिन्धो दीनबन्धो जगत्पते रूपेश गोपिका कान्त राधा कान्त नमोस्तुते तप्त कांचन गौरांगी राधे वृंदावनेश्वरी वृषभानुसुते देवी प्रणमामि हरिप्रिये वाञ्छाकल्पतरुभ्यश्च कृपा सिन्धुभ्यैव च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः। जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर शिवासादि गौर भक्तवृंद हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे। So reading once again for those of you who just joined, we are going to read from and discuss the conversation titled The Physics of the Self. This is from the book The Journey of the Self-Discovery. My intention here also is to maybe to inspire all of us, including myself, to read Srila Prabhupada's books and go deeper into what he's trying to give to us through his books. For those of you who have been practicing Krishna consciousness, you know the importance of Srila Prabhupada's books. I don't know if someone on the call is new, but if you're new to either ISKCON or the process of Krishna consciousness, I would like to say at the outset that the practice of Krishna consciousness and how well we do it really hinges on how well we have studied Srila Prabhupada's books. It's actually a quite simple correlation, nothing complicated. Those who have gone deeper in studying Srila Prabhupada's books, in hearing from him, have advanced very nicely. And those who also spread the knowledge in his books are also performing very important service to the society, because the knowledge and wisdom that's there in Srila Prabhupada's books is not something that is easily available elsewhere. So this is a very, very precious body of knowledge, because Srila Prabhupada not only gave the essence of the ancient Indian wisdom, but he gave it in a way that was so easily understandable. One spiritual teacher called it this way. He said Srila Prabhupada pablumized the Vedic knowledge for our understanding, right? Pablum is baby food. So just like babies cannot digest foods that are complex, and they have to be given very simple foods that they can digest, like baby pablum or cereals and so on. So like that, Srila Prabhupada, being very kind and compassionate, gave the essence of the Vedic knowledge in a very simple and digestible form. And if we read his books, we'll understand why that is so, right? So, and this chapter is one example of it. So once again, this is a conversation that happened in October 1973 between Dr. Gregory Benford, an associate professor at that time of physics at University of California, Irvine, and Srila Prabhupada in the garden of Los Angeles Krishna Center. Right? The chapter is titled The Physics of the Self. It's found in the Journey of Self-Discovery. So actually the conversation begins with, at least the way it's captured in this book, begins with Srila Prabhupada asking a very simple question, but a very profound one at the same time. He asks Dr. Benford, what is the current scientific knowledge about the spirit soul? And Dr. Benford, in turn, he represents a very nice student here, sitting in front of a master. And he says, we virtually no scientific knowledge about the soul. So very honest reply. But he didn't probably expect what was coming after that from Srila Prabhupada. So Srila Prabhupada said, therefore, you actually made no advancement in scientific knowledge. Right? And Dr. Benford in response says, he gets a little defensive. He says, well, scientific knowledge is a different class of knowledge. Right? So then Prabhupada talks about how there are different departments of knowledge. The study of the body, the psychological study of the mind, and then ultimately the spiritual transcendental knowledge, right? So Prabhupada's point is quite simple. He says the body and mind are simply the coverings of the spirit soul, just as the shirt and coat are coverings for your body. So he says, if you simply take care of the shirt and coat and neglect the person who's covered by the shirt and coat, do you think that this is advancement of knowledge? And Dr. Benford makes somewhat of what I would call a pushback statement, right? So he says, I think there is no category of knowledge that is useless. So it's interesting how the conversation is evolving already, right? So he's inferring from what Prabhupada said that any knowledge that is not about the knowledge of the self is useless. But Srila Prabhupada did not use the word useless, at least yet. So definitely Dr. Benford is inferring something. And he's getting a little defensive.
I did open, but took a
Can you all hear me? Okay, I'm muting everyone else, okay? In case if someone has a question, I will not know, but I will first open the forum for questions, okay? So then Prabhupada clarifies. So he says, I'm not saying it's useless, but the central point of knowledge must be the knowledge of the soul, because that's the most important department of knowledge. And then Dr. Benford makes a very interesting point, which is, he says the only form of knowledge that is verifiable in the sense of getting everybody to agree with it is that which can be proved logically or experimentally. Right? And this is where Srila Prabhupada's response to this is very interesting. So instead of saying that, hey, yes, the soul is not something that can be seen or verified, so yeah, I understand it is difficult to accept the reality of the soul, blah, blah, blah. Prabhupada didn't go there. He actually came back with a very interesting argument. He said, the signs of the self actually can be verified logically, right? And Dr. Benford became curious. He's like, how so? How's that possible? And then Prabhupada, this is the first time Prabhupada begins to indirectly refer to one of the verses in Bhagavad Gita, right? Dehinosmin yata dehe kaumaram yavvanam jaram tata dehantara praptir dhirastatra namuhyati, right? So he says, just consider your body. You once had the body of a child, but now you don't have that body anymore. You have a different body. Yet anyone can understand that you once had the body of a child. So your body has changed, but you are still remaining. Dr. Benford says, I'm not so sure that it is the same I. Prabhupada says, yes, you are the same I, just as the parents of a child will say after he has grown up, oh, just see how our son has grown. He is the same person. His parents say so, his friends say so, his family says so, everyone says so. This is the evidence. You have to accept this point because there's so much evidence. Watch carefully the words Srila Prabhupada uses. He says, you have to accept this point, not because I say so, but because there is so much evidence. Your mother will deny that you are a different person, even though you have a different body. Right? And the evidence Srila Prabhupada talks about is actually pretty solid evidence. Right? Just because our body grows, our relatives and friends and society around us, they don't think of us as a different person. So there's definitely beyond the body, there's some other reality. Right? And Srila Prabhupada is presenting this knowledge in a way that is relatable to this professor, who most likely wasn't exposed to this level of Vedic knowledge before. And this is a good lesson for us as well, those of us who are students and followers of Srila Prabhupada, to understand from him how to present transcendental knowledge to people who may not have had any exposure before. Right? He keeps it very objective, very logical, and the level that this professor will be able to appreciate. So Dr. Benford says, but I may not be the same being that I was. Prabhupada validates that comment. He says, yes, correct. You're not the same means, for example, that a young child may talk nonsense. but when he gets an adult body, he does not speak foolishly. So this is an interesting statement. I don't know why he said that, but I think he is indirectly probably inspiring the professor to speak sense. Although he's the same person, along with his change in body, he has developed different consciousness. But the spirit soul, the person, is the same. Right? So, the body may change. The concept is very simple. The body may change, but the self that is residing in the body is eternal. It does not change. And in fact, the body that we receive or that we have is is functioning because of the self, but also as soon as the self takes on a particular body, the body does have a significant influence on the activities of the self, right? So Srila Prabhupada just gives an example. When the soul takes on the body of a dog, the influence of the body is so strong that it has to, or at least we should say, it appears to act like a dog, right? It has to bark. And it has to do all the dog things that it's supposed to do in that body, right? So according to the circumstances, the activities of the soul are changing. So some of us are teachers, some of us are scientists, some of us are healthcare professionals, some of us are administrators, right? So we have different professions, we are in different circumstances, but at the end of the day, the principle is the same. That the principle is the self has a body, the self is different from the body, the self is eternal, the body is temporary and changing, and according to the form, according to the particular body that the self resides in, the activities of the self are influenced by that, right? So it may seem like the self is changing, but actually it just the change of the body, and then there's change of activities or circumstances because of that change of the body, right? But the self itself is changeless. So Dr. Benford and any materialist, for example, for that matter, so any one of us who's in material consciousness, we all think that way, that I'm changing, right? But in fact, we are not changing. It's the circumstances around us, the material energy that is around us, that is undergoing transformation. Elsewhere in the Bhagavad Gita, Srila Prabhupada talks about the body undergoing 6 kinds of transformation, right? It takes birth, it grows, it produces byproducts, it dwindles, and so on. So the self during all this is actually changeless. So the body may move from one station to another, or one apartment to another, or may change from one garment to another garment, but the spirit soul, which is us, is actually changeless. And this knowledge is at the core of transcendental knowledge. If we cannot accept or understand this principle that I am changeless and everything around me in the material world is changing, but that change doesn't influence or doesn't impact the soul in any eternal in an eternal manner, right? It doesn't. The soul doesn't get impacted. You know, we have verses in the Bhagavad Gita that clarify this. The soul cannot be attacked by any weapons. It cannot be moistened. It cannot be burned. It cannot be killed by a virus, for example, like we are seeing today with the coronavirus situation. So there's so many changes that are happening around us. But despite all that, we should understand that the self itself is intact during all these changes. Very, very important point. So therefore, Prabhupada says the conclusion is Tata Dehantara Praptir Dhiras Tatra Namuhyati. When this body is finished, the soul gives it up and accepts another body. Then Srila Prabhupada explains how the body develops in the womb of a mother, but because of the presence of the soul, right? And he says the body is developed to completion in 7 months. Then consciousness comes. Dr. Benford becomes very curious at this statement because it's so specific. He hasn't probably heard this before. He's like, at 7 months? Prabhupada says, yes. And he explains why that milestone is important. He says, at that time, the child wants to come out. He feels uncomfortable, therefore he prays to God to kindly release him from the bondage. He promises that when he gets out, he'll become a devotee of God. So after 9 months, he comes out of the womb, but unless his parents are devotees, due to circumstances, he forgets God. So Srila Prabhupada explains the importance of, or I should also say the good fortune of the souls that take birth in the family of God-conscious parents. And Dr. Benford, he really likes this information that he's receiving from Srila Prabhupada. He says, is it true that the children of all such parents are somewhat spiritually superior to the children of other parents? And Prabhupada says, generally, yes. They get the opportunity of being trained by the mother and father. And then he explains, he actually shares memories about his own father, how nice a devotee he was and a parent he was. Not only, of course, giving birth, but giving this facility in this life, but also training in Krishna consciousness. So that's very important as well. So Dr. Benford asked, what will happen to you and your students next? Prabhupada said, we are going back to Krishna. We have got everything. We have Krishna's name, we have his address, Krishna's form, Krishna's activities. We know everything and we are going there. Krishna promises this in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 4, text 9. Janma karma chame divyam evam yo veti tatvataha. Tyaktva deham punarjanma naiti mameti surjna. One who knows me in truth, scientifically. So once again, Srila Prabhupada gives the right meaning of tattva and makes it relatable to this professor who's listening from him, right? So one who knows me in truth, scientifically, Krishna says, is eligible to enter into the kingdom of God. Upon leaving the body, he does not take his birth again in this material world, but attains my eternal abode. And then they talk about evolution. Not particularly Darwin is not mentioned, but it's implicit. But Srila Prabhupada presents the idea of spiritual evolution, basically how the soul moves from one apartment to another. So it is not that that the apartments are changing form from one to another. It's just the soul is moving from one apartment to another, right? So it's not like a monkey is evolving into the form of a human being. It's actually the form of the monkey is there, the form of the human being is there, and all the other forms are there. It's the spirit soul, which is this atomic spiritual spark. It's moving from one form to another, one form to another, one form to another. So it is that which should be called evolution. It's not like the forms itself, they're changing. Now, within a particular form, there is changes happening. We talked about this earlier. There's 6 kinds of transformations. So that evolution is accepted in the Vedic literatures, right? Like this human form, it was body of a child, then youthful, and then it goes to old age and it dies. So that evolution is accepted, but it's not that the human form is changing to another form. So we don't accept that theory of evolution, to be clear. And then the conversation takes a very interesting turn. And I say that because Srila Prabhupada gets, in a very expert manner, he gets very personal, right, with Dr. Benford. He uses a particular moment to do so, right? Now that he has given the basic knowledge to Dr. Benford, so Benford asks, undoubtedly you are aware that there are a few people both in Eastern and Western society who feel it a bit more intellectually justifiable to be completely agnostic about matters of theology. They feel more or less that if God had wanted us to show something more about him, then he would have made it more easily apprehendable. Now, instead of trying to justify Krishna's actions or lack thereof, because Dr. Benford is saying God should have essentially made it easy for everyone to understand him, right? And Prabhupada is not saying, oh yeah, you're right. I wish it was a little easier. Instead, he says, then you don't believe in God? And Dr. Benford says, it's somewhat of a troubled response here. He says, I don't not believe in God, right? I'm just not forming an opinion until I have some evidence. Then Prabhupada presses him a little bit. He says, but do you think there's God or not? And Dr. Benford says, I have a suspicion that there may be, but it is unverified. Srila Prabhupada says, but you think sometimes that there may be God, do you not? Dr. Benford said yes. And this is the moment you see Srila Prabhupada masterfully brings someone who has this dormant consciousness, is not totally atheistic, who's inquisitive. He brings this person to the next level, which is, he says, so you're in doubt, suspicion, you're not certain. So Srila Prabhupada more, he's taking the position of the spiritual master, even more so. But your inclination is that you think there is a God, is it not? Your knowledge being imperfect, you're in doubt. That's all. Otherwise, you're inclined to think of God. But because you're a scientific man, unless you perceive it scientifically, you do not accept. That is your position. But from your side, you believe in God. Benford says, reluctantly, he says, yeah, sometimes. But Prabhupada says, yes, sometimes or at all times. It doesn't matter. That is the position of everyone. As long as one is in the human form of life, he has a dormant consciousness of God. It simply has to be developed by proper training. Just like everything else in life. Then Prabhupada explains the importance of the government the government's responsibility to teach or awaken this dormant God consciousness in everyone, right? And he says that's the failure of modern education or modern governments, in that they don't have this department of knowledge about the self. They do not have facilities for training people in God consciousness. So then Dr. Benford gives an excuse. He says, of course, the reason is separation of church and state. But Prabhupada didn't, dwell too much on that. He says reasons there may be many, but the principal reason is that this age is the age of Kali Yuga, the age of quarrel and hypocrisy. He says people are not very intelligent. Therefore, they are trying to avoid this department of knowledge, the most important department of knowledge. Then he talks about how it is this department of knowledge and focusing on something like that is what would distinguish a human being from other forms of life, right? Animals and so on. And Prabhupada basically says, the animals are eating, sleeping, mating, and defending. And we human beings are just doing it in a more polished manner. But Dr. Benford, of course, doesn't accept this immediately. He's not fully convinced. He feels like, he thinks that human beings are doing something more advanced because we have technology, we are going places. He brings up this example of the moon mission, right? Remember, this was 1973. So the moon mission was very fresh in everyone's minds at that time. So he says, what do you think about the moon mission? Prabhupada says, that is also sleeping. You spend so much money to go there and sleep, that's all. Otherwise, what can you do there? Benford says you can go there and learn. Prabhupada says you go there and sleep, that's all, sleeping. You're spending billions and getting nothing in return. Dr. Benford says it's worth more than that. No, nothing more, because these four principles are the background. So once again, we see this very interesting difference in consciousness between the professor and between Srila Prabhupada, right? So Dr. Benford keeps going to the form, right? He keeps going to the externals. he keeps giving importance to the configurations of matter or the movements of material energy. So he thinks if we can configure matter better or study matter very deeply or make technological advancements, we are somehow more advanced than other forms of life. But Srila Prabhupada, on the other hand, is taking his consciousness is on the substance behind the form, right? So Prabhupada is very much focused on the principle of substance, the principle of the self, because without that, the form doesn't have much meaning, doesn't have much utility, right? And in fact, he makes a very interesting connection after laying this background knowledge. He says, actually, Dr. Benford picks up on this. He says, Dr. Benford says, you seem to place emphasis on what knowledge does for you. And he asks, what about the sheer joy of discovering how nature works? And he talks about, how we know more about the grass, for example, because we have microscopes and other analytical methods. So we know what is a grass made up of and all that. But Prabhupada is not very interested or impressed. He says, but what is the benefit? Even if you knew every particle of the grass, what would be the benefit? So it's a very important moment in this conversation. Srila Prabhupada is highlighting two things here. One is, what does your knowledge do for you and the benefit of the society? That's one. But then next he is going to take Dr. Benford to another platform of knowledge, which is, instead of studying God, who is source of the grass, you would rather study the grass. So he's challenging Dr. Benford that why not study the Supreme Person who has created these things instead of separately studying the various forms of his creation. Right? And then the conversation reaches the climax, right? The final nail in the coffin, to say, to speak. So Srila Prabhupada basically says, if you just study matter separately from God, it's basically a waste of time. Dr. Benford says, but why is it a waste? And listen to this. Prabhupada says, certainly it is a waste because the result is not useful. And Dr. Benford says, well, what is useful? Srila Prabhupada says, it is useful to know yourself, who you are, what you are. Why is this knowledge of myself better than knowledge of a plant? And here's how Prabhupada concludes this conversation. If you understand what you are, then you understand other things. That is called Atma Tattva, Atma Jnana, self-knowledge. That is important. I'm a spirit soul. I'm passing through so many species of life. But what is my position? I don't wish to die because I'm afraid to change bodies. Therefore, I'm afraid of death. This question should be raised first. I don't want unhappiness, but unhappiness comes. I don't want death, but death comes. I don't want disease, but disease comes. I don't want to become an old man, but old age comes anyway. I don't want to become an old man, but old age comes anyway. What is the reason that these things are coming by force? Who is enforcing these things? I do not know. But these are the real problems. I don't want excessive heat, but there is excessive heat. Why? Who's enforcing these things? Why are these being enforced? I don't want this heat. What have I done? These are real questions, not just studying foliage and writing volumes of books. That is a waste of energy. Study yourself. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Are there any questions or comments?
I'm sorry, I joined late. Who is Dr. Benefort that you were talking about, Prabhu?
So he was an associate professor of physics at University of California. This was a conversation 1973.
I see.
Found in this book.
What is the book?
The Journey of Self-Discovery.
Oh, I see.
Any questions?
Hare Krishna Prabhuji.
Hare Krishna.
This is Madhav Kantadas.
Hare Krishna Prabhu.
Hare Krishna Prabhu. Thank you for sharing. It's really very wonderful and very clear. I'm going back to the beginning of this conversation and the example that you quoted. So body is changing. An example is when one is child and when one become adult, body is changing and self remain the same. In addition to body, activity is changing too. That you also. So my question is more on activity. Probably I'm trying to understand. Not so when body is changing from child to adult, activity is changing too.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this change in activities, can we explain as change in maturity? Now, when I use word maturity, especially typically in our ISKCON, like we heard, is a soul, and the coverings are mind, intelligence, and false ego. Now, if this change in activities is really because of change in intelligence, that is what I'm trying to understand.
The intelligence is definitely changing, right? Because, and to the degree that the intellect is exposed to material or spiritual knowledge, it's going to mature, right? So, but for most people, that intellect is being nourished by material education. So in that sense, there is material maturity that is happening. But unfortunately, that maturity, as you know, is it doesn't last, because as soon as the soul leaves this body, that the knowledge that was gained at a material level is not something that is retained eternally, right? So yeah, the maturity is also changing along with the activities. Now, one thing we have, our understanding is the way the mind and the intellect and ego works for a materialist is different from how it will work for a Krishna conscious person, right? Because in the case of a materialist, the mind is more powerful than the intellect. So much so, the intellect serves the demands of the mind. The mind wants this kind of sense gratification. The intellect does all it can to basically engage in 20 years of university education to serve the demand of the mind. So the intellect becomes subservient. But in the in the case of a spiritually advanced person or a Krishna conscious individual, it is the other way. The intellect, because of its spiritual maturity, can control the mind, and then the mind in turn can control the senses, and which means our activities and behaviors can be controlled. Right? So there is that distinction, which is a crucial and very important distinction. Does that help, Prabhu?
Yes, Prabhuji. Yeah, certain. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
But how does maturity come at different levels for different people? Like, we hear of Prahlad Maharaj at 5 years old, and even amongst ourselves, there are deeply mature people at 14, 15, 16, and, maturity levels come at different times. How do you account for that?
So there is definitely there's a few things. There's influence of the parents' maturity on the child, right? So the psychology and intellectual capacity and the genetics of the parents and the ancestors do play a role in the in the maturity of a child, but also there may be some special, in some very rare cases or special cases, there may be influence from even from previous lives, where an impression may have been made, or a set of impressions may have been made so deeply in the mind and the intellect that is carried on to the next body, or in this lifetime, for example, right? So, for example, the self is, since the self is moving from one body to another, in this lifetime, we may be in the line of certain parents and ancestors, but in a previous life or lifetime, we may have been in other family systems, and it's possible that some of that is carried over as well, right? And in certain rare cases, those impressions are very strong, and they could possibly manifest, right? So we see both in if we talk just in the case of materialists, there are some children who has some very special abilities, right? A child who is 5 years old is able to do piano like Beethoven, for example, or Mozart. Those are very rare abilities that are probably coming from previous impressions.
No, I get that. I'm not talking about those special abilities. I'm saying, like, even generally in the devotee in the devotee population, I would think that we all have some impression from our past lives that has brought us to where we are. Like we hear of devotees out of the blue taking to Krishna consciousness, and even amongst us Indians, many of us might have born in the Hindu community and even in Vaishnava communities, but not everyone understands the essence, of Vaishnavism and the goal of life,
Right.
Just to have that good fortune has to have come some adnyata sukriti or something that you did in your past life,
So this is a very interesting topic. I think you're probably referring to this question of how does bhakti originate? Right?
Yeah.
And this, I remember I speaking on this almost a year or two back at the temple. And this is a topic especially Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur goes in great detail to answer. And there's some very important concepts there, but I'll share a couple of quick thoughts here, but this is a whole different class. So I won't go into too much detail, but hopefully these couple of points are useful for you. Because I found them to be useful for myself. One is bhakti is purely transcendental. So there is no material driver for bhakti. So because Bhakti Devi or Krishna's Yoga Maya potency is completely independent. So Bhakti Devi is completely independent. There's nothing material that can drive bhakti to take seat in the heart of any person. There's nothing material that can drive that. And then Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur talks about different causes of bhakti and so on and so forth. And then finally he concludes, bhakti is actually ultimately the mercy of the devotee who is carrying Krishna's bhakti in different ways, right? And sharing that. So he uses this somehow or the other. Different souls come in contact with what you mentioned earlier, this Ajnata Sukriti or this moment of this transmission from this devotee, especially the Madhyamadikari, who's carrying these seeds of bhakti and is trying to share. That's how bhakti is received. It's purely by the mercy of Krishna and through his devotee who is taking the message of Krishna everywhere. There's nothing material that causes bhakti. Now, there may be some material facilities that we have, either in our own body or in external circumstances, that could be used to facilitate the manifestation of the bhakti in this world. Sure, and those facilities may come from past impressions and all that, but bhakti itself is not caused by any of that. Because bhakti she's independent. She's purely transcendental. So that's why mercy is so important, and praying for the mercy of the Lord and the Acharyas is so much emphasized. And we see that even in the writings of all our Acharyas, before they even write their books, they all seek the mercy, right? That's the first thing that they do in their invocation. Because it's all descending mercy. And how it exactly happens is a mystery.
Yeah, I think you have hit the nail on the head. That's what I was looking for. So I think ultimately, the answer that I'm seeing from you is that it's the mercy, that because it always boggles my mind how some people can read the Bhagavad Gita in many different ways for 40 years and still not understand that Krishna is the ultimate goal and the subject matter of the Bhagavad Gita. And some people just get it instantly, So how does that happen? It has to be the mercy element, I think, as you described.
Yeah, because there's no partiality involved here. Krishna is not partial. But after Bhakti Devi gets someone going, then of course Krishna gets deeply involved. That is true, because he does take care of his devotees more. That is true. But it's even there's no partiality. It's only we have this verse, right? Ye yatamam prapadyante tamstataiva bhajami. So it's as one moves forward, Krishna reciprocates accordingly. So it's beautiful system. And it still maintains Krishna's impartiality, non-enviousness, all those qualities, which is amazing. It's
Yes.
mind-boggling.
It is. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it is.
I should say inconceivable. Right.
Yeah, it's inconceivable. Yeah, because sometimes we can try to convince someone till the cows come home, and it just does not get through.
It doesn't.
And then you wonder
But we
why,
do-
because they are intelligent people that we're talking to.
Right. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Is Pyariman Prabhu online? I see his name, but maybe he's busy. Rasraj Prabhu, is there a hard stop at 5? Is there a hard stop at 5, or if someone has any questions, we can continue? Okay. Okay. Okay, no problem. Yeah. So, is there any final burning questions?
No.
Okay.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Yes. Is there a question or a comment? Okay. Maybe she was just saying Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna, Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
But
Time. Wonderful.